Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for joining us for the premiere of this lovely documentary by Richard Shaw. If you missed the part or wish to watch it again, the documentary will be available for a few more days. My name is Máté Vince. I'm the director of the Hungarian Cultural Centre here in London, and in a minute I'll give the virtual floor to our experts on the Halas Batchelor studio and their impact on British and world animation. But before I do that, let me just take a moment to recall why John Halas, or János Halas as we pronounce it, is so important to us. When we talk about him, we're talking about the Sir Alexander Code of cartoons, László Moholy Nagy of filmmaking, and Béla Bartók of visual arts flow. So Halas is definitely a member of an exceptionally talented, great generation, born and raised before and during the First World War, and had to leave Hungary because of the terrible dictatorships forced upon us. And people like Halas leaving was an unquestionable loss for Hungary. However, it made the Hungarian talent known worldwide. 80 years ago, Halas and Joy Batchelor got married and founded a studio, which was the longest running animation film studio in Great Britain. And coming from a Hungarian background, a nation torn by war so frequently, their anti-war clips have a substantial meaning to us. And when we watch Animal Farm, the story of Napoleon and Snowball rising up against Farmer Johns, only to become dictators themselves, to us it's a chilling resemblance of our 20th century history, drifting back and forth between Nazi and communist revolutions and oppressions. And although John Halas passed away 25 years ago, the messages and characters of him and Joy are becoming more relevant than ever. And that's the reason why the story must be told. And this time, this is not an exaggeration or overused phrase. And that's because we have a panel of experts led by Martin Pickles, the head of London Animation Club. So without further ado, I'll give the virtual floor to Martin to carry on with this informative evening. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Máté, for that marvellous introduction. A few technical things before we begin. Can you set your Zoom to speaker view rather than gallery view for this to, otherwise you're just going to have a sprinkling of tiny boxes. Down the right-hand side of the screen, you should be able to type in questions, and I'll be reading those out as we go along. And I believe that all viewers are automatically muted, but if you find that you're not, could you click to mute just so that we don't get any kind of noise interference in the background, if that's all right. So that's the technical side done. The guests tonight, the speakers tonight, are Vivien Halas, John and Joy's daughter, who is a graphic designer and graphic artist, and currently looks after the Halas Batchelor collection since 1996, I believe. Paul Halas, John and Joy's son, who's enjoyed a massive career in comics, interestingly for Disney, and in particular story writing, I believe. Joanna Quinn, who is for me a living legend and one of the most marvellous contemporary British animators, who's perhaps best known for her series of Beryl films. Jess Stewart, who is the curator even of animation for the BFI National Archive. Have I forgotten anyone? No, I think that is all our guests. I'm Martin Pickles. I run something called London Animation Club, which is a series of monthly events. So I'd just like to kick things off. Vivien, I'd like to start with you. So here we are in the context of the Insiders Outsiders Festival. How much do you think John's sensibility and drive and outlook was through his Hungarian background, his Hungarian identity?
Good question. If you think about it, my father embraced all things British. He saw himself as being rather English, and at the same time he was so Hungarian. He always had an accent. He never lost it. He used to drive us mad. He worked with and took on board all kinds of other outsiders, brought them inside, living in Hampstead, which was in those days not a posh place, but somewhere you could live cheaply. They worked with people like Matthias Scheiber and Francis Chagrin, and there was a kind of artist community around there. And they all helped each other. So being Hungarian was very important to him, although he felt very English.
Jez, could I just bring you in here at this point? I get the impression that British animation is, the history of British animation in a way is a history of international animation. It has benefited from many European immigrants. It seems to be a truly international form, a truly international art form. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just European, really. In terms of, if you think of, okay, the Great British Animated Colour Box, Len Lai, well, he's from New Zealand, and then you have to John Halas. Peter Sachs is a really pivotal character coming from Germany, and real crux of a kind of modernization of animation in the post-war commercial period. Terry Gilliam, oh no, he's American. The Quay brothers, oh no, they're American.
All right, you've caught me.
And you suddenly start to build all these characters that actually, that define it. Okay, how do we define British animation? Because it isn't necessarily, a lot of it is populated by people who've come from overseas. And one of the most interesting things that I find about British animation is that it often has been a somewhat kind of impoverished state. It's not been particularly supported by arts bodies or anything else. It's been commercially run. It's a hard place to make a living as an animator. And so the fact that people have come overseas and come here, it's the hardiest breed who have come here, and they've often had the kind of these distinctive visions, and they've made these curious fruits. So I do think it's something about the sort of the hostility of the environment and the fact that it actually allows some diverse and interesting minds to flower. I think that's really interesting.
But clearly there were opportunities as well, and it seems that John took to Britain in a particular way. Vivien, may I ask about the situation under which your parents met? Because you have Joy working in Hungary, which is an interesting sort of inversion.
Yes, well, they met though in London, because John came over to start a studio with his partners in Hungary, Kalorishram, Dad being Jewish and his other partner being Catholic. When an opportunity came up to set something up here, they said, oh, well, you can go, John. And he went, yes, 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 because for him, going somewhere else, especially England, was a good opportunity to start something else. And when he got here, he spoke no English, never stopped him. And he looked for people. He put out an ad and he found my mother, who was already an experienced animator. And that's how they met. And later, he took her back to Budapest to work in his old studio because it was more efficient and probably cheaper to work in Budapest. Didn't last very long, but I think the moment that they really enjoyed together was that first working together in Budapest with his old colleagues, and she felt wonderful because she was the center of attention. And well, it was the first flush of love and my father feeling that he'd found this wonderful creative person that was going to help.
Paul, can you tell us a little bit about how the contrast or the dynamic between your parents worked?
Yes, yes. My father was the showman. He was the producer. He was the one who went out and made the contacts, got the work. Joy, I think, especially when she became a mother, was content more to sit back, more to be on the side of pre-production, writing, to take a less prominent role. I think it suited their personalities, and she really was a fantastic creator. She was a fantastic writer. I think John realized that. He did realize where her strengths lay as well, and I think he deferred to her ability to write, to organize, to be the power behind the production, whereas he fronted it. So I think they slipped into this role, which was aided and abetted by parenthood. To be frank, our father did not take naturally to being a father. His children were the films, it was the studio, it was the productions. Joy was more split down the middle. So she did her pre-production, her writing, and let him get on with the glory.
The showing off.
Simon, I think there's a little bit of kind of audio bleed going on. Do you mind muting? Because I think we can hear ourselves beamed back through the microphone. Say again, Vivien.
Martin, I'm really sorry. Just to interrupt, I have a feeling there might be some other people waiting.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I had a feeling this would happen. Just check, because it would be a shame for them to be left.
Yes.
If you just keep checking, if you don't mind. Thanks ever so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sorry about that. Vivien, you were about to say.
Well, only I was endorsing what Paul was saying, is that, you know, once my mother had us, she was very torn. And as she was multi-talented, is the thing. She could have had a wonderful career as maybe an illustrator or a writer, but with animation it all came together and it suited her very well. But she had the most marvelous sense of synthesis, of précis, of making difficult subjects seem easy. And she was one of the most interesting people to talk to. You could talk about almost any subject, literature, gardening, you name it. Whereas our father, you could talk to him about a film or design. And really, he only took an interest in us when we could discuss graphic design or animation. And before that, he wasn't very present.
Now, Vivien, you once said that perhaps the clue was in the name of the studio. It was Halas and Batchelor. Mm-hmm. And that in situations like this, one perhaps forgets the second name, really. It's about sort of first billing. But I understand that was rather different at one point, in that your mother am I right in thinking that your mother supported them by doing any illustration work that was available, and that she was very, very prolific?
Yes. When they first came back from Hungary, which was just before the war, they had no work, no money, and she was the one that was the front person, because at that time our father couldn't really speak English very well. So she went out, very good looking, blonde, very talented. She was selling her illustrations rather well, and then saying, and he's really good too, and look at this airbrush work. And then luckily, John re-met Moholy-Nagy, and he gave them work, especially my father. But it was really Joy that made the initial contacts.
And I suppose that's reflected in the way her style was the Halas and Batchelor style throughout that that early period. I think that's very apparent. Paul, if you don't mind me asking, you described the dynamic. I mean, did that between your parents on a professional level? I mean, is that how they were as people as well?
Yes. My mother was more measured. She was more laid back than he was. In social life, again, he was there up front. He was booming. He was full of bonhomie. My mother was more for having the quiet conversations, for going into things more in depth. I think it showed fundamentally different personalities. They did mesh very, very well together professionally, but they were very, very different people.
Yes, I think that's clear. Jez, may I bring you in at this point? There seemed to be a shift in the house style. It's almost as though the history of the studio is divided into two halves. Would you suggest that's the case?
Yes, if you look at the first decade of the company, then what they're making are mostly commercials in the early period. It's all done with the small team in house. Starting in 1940, they were working with an advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson. They actually worked a lot with Alexander McKendrick, who would do a lot of the storyboards and sketches and help them do these early things, as he had done with actually George Powell, another Hungarian animator, and Anson Dyer, whose studio Halas Batchelor took over. But so they had this style, and they were coming up with their own ideas, and that's very apparent that the kind of the scripts and the stories in the storyboards in the archive that we hold at the BFI, that it's Joy's drawings, it's Joy's handwriting on the script, and it's there, and it was a manageable body of work. In the post-war period, they kind of managed to build up this, as you saw in the documentary, they built up this relationship with the government and making these sort of films, and they managed to have this real foothold in an industry by making, having a regular gig at these kind of sort of 10-minute short Technicolor cartoons that helped them expand the studio, whilst also making commercial work and starting to do their own projects. Where the big change then comes in, I guess, is the fact that suddenly they're having to take on this feature film project of a size and scale that hadn't really been seen before, and that involved all kinds of different sort of designers and animators and different voices coming in to make something of that size. They had to basically, quadruple the size of the studio to do it, and then on the back end of that, they basically expanded into the time. So commercial television starts in 1955 in Great Britain, and that was another opportunity for expansion. It was also it was a time of big change in British animation studios. They went from these big sort of behemoths, and you had to have your full ink and paint department to basically make these big color commercials. Suddenly you didn't. You needed you needed to make 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 7 seconds of black and white animation, and you could get on TV, and you get these sort of more punkish studios, small scale studios, and you get the sort of dissipation of talent and the atomization in the industry. And there was so much work going on that you couldn't have the same sort of like everybody working on the same thing. I think stuff was being made quicker, it was turned over quicker, and you had more different individual artists and voices and talents basically contributing to it. And so you start to see the dissipation of the style. And also the successes are basically starting to bring new people in. You're starting to work with people like Peter Foldesh, who did the backgrounds for Magic Canvas. You have all these different voices coming in, and it did change the studio because it expanded. And the 60s were different again in terms of they were sort of hard times. And suddenly you had the growth of educational film, but then you also had the studio taking on almost kind of work for hire to make short cartoons for American television companies. So you have these landmark American characters like Popeye and the Lone Ranger and even the Jackson 5 being made in Stroud and London by Halas Batchelor. So the style is all kind of missing around as the studio expanded. So there's less of that distinctive personality because you're working on the hoof.
Now, it would be easy to suppose that at that point, or rather at the point, let's say, of commercial television and so on, that Joy was taking a back seat because perhaps her style was no longer the signature style, but in fact she was still very active within the studio, but perhaps less visible. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I think that's definitely the case in some ways, but they were suddenly working on so many different fronts that that the most visible, you don't get credited for commercial work, for kind of adverts. You don't get credited for kind of sponsored films often. It's kind of hidden away. And so the work that's there is much harder to piece on any one person, whereas the work that's most known for Halas Batchelor now, the sort of the independent short films, seem to be much more John's thing. These are the things that were getting the profile festivals that were bringing attention to the agency, and Joy's name is on these less. So Magic Canvas, for example, is directed by John Halas, not John and Joy, and so that there seems to be, I guess there's a kind of a twist in there, and all that commercial work that was being done, and maybe there was a step down in terms of the volume of it for Joy. Vivien and Paul will be able to tell you better, but that kind of work, which she was incredibly good at, is more anonymous. You don't get kind of credits at the end of a TV commercial, so it's harder to put people's fingerprints on things.
Now, Vivien, I think you tried to, if you like, rediscover the film credits of your mother, which perhaps were less visible. And I think you did a study of this in one of the books.
Here you are.
Yep.
In this book here, a moving image.
I have my own copy. Hi, Joanna.
Oh, snap. Well, I went through and all the films, and I marked what she did in each one. And I tell you, she was very active. She's credited, though, with things like direction, production, and script. But mostly it comes through that John got the credit. In fact, sometimes her name comes up as Mrs. Halas, which is, I don't know how that happened. I don't know that she was that bothered at the time. But anyway, I went through it all and discovered that, yes, she was rather unsung, but she sort of didn't lose interest exactly, but she was pretty fed up with it all, and she would have liked to have retired and done something else. And our father would never have done anything else because that's really all he was interested in. Whereas she had a much wider scope of things that she liked. And she was well read, whereas he really was the kind of person who only read things if he thought they'd be useful to make a film.
It does suggest that John had a fundamental need to make films, almost like eating or breathing or something like that, which does suggest an incredible drive, but perhaps one that was not conducive to perhaps to family life. I mean, was this, presumably this is problematic?
Well, I think it will be interesting to bring Joanna in, because there you are, she makes wonderful films.
Yeah.
And manages to do everything and has a marvellous daughter as well. We might ask her.
Yes, absolutely. I honestly was about to bring you in, Joanna. I mean, I think what's apparent about Joy is she took on a male-dominated world on her own terms, but perhaps is not, whilst being a good role model, is perhaps not a feminist. I'm under the impression that she took on a patriarchal society on her own terms, but perhaps it wasn't ideological, that she felt that if someone were talented, they should be successful or allowed an opportunity. regardless of any other factor. I was wondering, how might she have managed in the present day?
Well, if I think of my own experience, I think because of the way I was brought up by my mother, who was very feminist and just thought I can do whatever I want, and she encouraged me to do whatever I wanted. So I never felt barriers, but of course, I was years later, and so it was in the 1980s. I was at college, and I have to say I've been terribly lucky. I've been able to do everything that I've wanted to do, but I think maybe I was at a lucky time where feminism was beginning to become quite political, and there were Spare Rib magazine and things, and it was quite an exciting time to make films as a woman, and Channel 4 wanted to fund more women, so it was a very good time. I was very lucky, and I think it's probably still the same if you're a filmmaker. If you've got a story to tell, it's very different. I think if you work in different areas of animation which are very male dominated, that's completely different. But if you've got a story to tell, then I think it's probably it's easy, and I think she would have done well in this time as well, because she has got stories to tell.
Absolutely. I mean, she had the most remarkable work ethic, and thinking about the projects she worked on, Animal Farm was undeniably a great work of creativity, but with regard to other films, making information films and so on, all her work in some way or another was commercial. I think, broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that her work, even the most expressive work, was nonetheless either commissioned or commercial. How might she have managed outside of an arena like that? Vivien, I'd just be interested to know, what would she have been an author in the same way that your father was with films like Magic Canvas? Do you think that she would have developed more of an independent voice as a filmmaker?
I've no idea. What I do know is that there were projects just after Animal Farm with de Rochemont, things like A Pilgrim's Progress. She did a whole script for that. Midsummer Night's Dream. She wanted to do things like the Lays of Marie de France. She was interested in translating things, if you like, and bringing them into film. But these projects needed money, and they never happened.
This does suggest a frustrated side of her career in that case, one that perhaps I hadn't fully appreciated, because of her example as someone who could survive and thrive in the commercial arena, for example, with her prolific illustrations. It does suggest that had the opportunity arisen, perhaps if the film industry hadn't been as conservative as it was, she might have actually had a great flowering as an independent filmmaker. Maybe.
I mean, if you look at some of the drawings, there's an early book where there's a lot of the drawings that she did with another immigrant, George Him. And they worked together, and they did these, I don't know if anyone can see it, these wonderful drawings together. And she liked working with other people, and yet she was rather stranded a lot of the time, coming home by 4 o'clock for us children. I mean, that didn't, as you know, children don't stay little forever, and we went off to college and things. But I don't know, I think there was a lot of disappointment in there.
Yes, I mean, do animatics survive of any of the unmade films that you've just described, A Midsummer Night's Dream?
Just drawings.
Just drawings, I see.
He's got the archive.
There's scripts and storyboards, and there's a whole range of versions of Pilgrim's Progress, actually, including one right up into the 80s, which is kind of turns it into some weird sci-fi thing. It's an idea that they kept coming back to, but never made. Yeah, it's the kind of script, the kind of unmade project. Yeah, so it would have been another thing. Interestingly, there's sort of also in the letters with de Rochemont, there's kind of correspondence around it. Clearly, the Midsummer Night's Dream was the film that they really wanted to do, suggesting above others, to the extent of getting sort of character designs and doing it. De Rochemont suggested to them that they make an animated adaptation of Charlotte's Web, which was animated in later years. But I know that would have been an interesting opportunity, but never quite fell into place, unfortunately, whether it was to sort of dangle as a character to move them on. And they did make a very short version of Midsummer Nights. It's kind of Midsummer Nightmare or something. Basically, it's a kind of an advert for TV. It's on the BFI player, but it only survives in German. But it's quite fun. There's some nice little animation of a Puck character, and it has this really quite interesting sort of live action sequences, and they're playing with the images of a guy in a TV set. It's a really interesting little film to look at if you're in the UK. Then it's on the BFI player, and I will look up the name of it now.
We'll come back to that, but a picture is emerging for me, at any rate, of a frustration. In that case, a great frustration of Joy's being unable to realise a career or an artistic fulfilment as an independent filmmaker.
Sorry to interrupt, Martin, but
yeah.
that sounds like British animation to me. That sounds like so many British animated story. I mean, yeah. So I just, in terms of that, it's called Midsummer Nightmare, but that's saying that the story is quite typical in many ways. I mean, that's what British animation has often been, that it has been about making these kind of commercial works to keep, Joanna made amazing toilet roll adverts for many years. I mean, that's what it kept the studios kind of moving and going, and it has been these other things, he's sacrificing to make the times to it. And you have this little kind of moment in the 80s and 90s with this kind of unprecedented, probably unfortunately unrepeatable support of Channel 4, kind of a channel with a completely different remit than anything else that had come before, and having a kind of a mandate to support diverse sectors and voices, and putting its faith into animation. So there's this moment there, but otherwise it has been pretty hard scrabble for most, and so their story is quite familiar in many ways, I think, to many British animators.
I think someone who could take credit for this is Claire Kitson, of course, who worked for John Halas, as we saw in the documentary, her period of being commissioning editor of animation at Channel 4, which was through the 90s. Was it late 80s and 90s?
I believe.
Yeah. I'd be interested to, someone very unkindly once said that Joy was the Margaret Thatcher of animation, which I straight away tried to stamp on.
Better hair.
But I mean, Joanna, I mean, when you were studying in the 1980s, was she seen in any way as a role model, or at least a trailblazer?
No, she wasn't. And it's a bit like what Emma Calder was saying in the documentary. It was the 80s and everybody was trying to do new stuff. And I think that the work of Halas Batchelor was seen slightly as old-fashioned at that time.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. And so, but I was very aware of Joy and the fact that there was Halas and Batchelor was a woman. And I do remember going to an exhibition, the Masters of Animation, and John Halas was there, but I don't remember Joy being there. But I remember that a lot of people were quite angry that it was called the Masters of Animation, because that made it very male, and I kept thinking, well, what about Joy? What about Joy? And so I was very aware of her and aware that she's done this amazing stuff, but I wasn't. It was old-fashioned, but I was very aware that she had done some wonderful stuff and that she was a trailblazer.
Vivien, I think your mother as a figure within animation is very much emerged then after the studio was deemed unfashionable for many years. At what point did this start to happen? And you've done marvelous
when
work.
we dug her up together. Because I just felt it was most unfair. And it's true that when Paul and I were young, they were deeply unfashionable. They were, I wouldn't say exactly a laughing stock, but practically. I mean, my father, it must be said, he was wonderful. He rose above it. There were all these scurrilous drawings on the notice board in the studio of him being dreadful, with gravy spills down his front and being terribly mean. And he used to laugh. He used to show people these things quite proudly. And they were quite unkind. I mean, Paul was there. He could tell you about it.
Paul, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, during a period in the late 70s, I was doing a lot of different work, including freelance paint and trace. And I just found myself by chance working in the studio from time to time. And by that time, John was flitting in and out. He was still doing all sorts of projects, very active, but he was out of the studio a lot of the time, and people did take the mickey a bit, and Viv's right. People did cartoons of him. He was well known for disappearing just after everybody had gone out for lunch and not reappearing until the middle of the afternoon. And everybody knew that he was going off to his favorite restaurants, but he maintained this fib that he worked through his lunch hour every day. And when the restaurants used to send round New Year calendars for him, he just brushed it off. He was totally unabashed.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I would like to know, Paul. In the documentary, there's the famous sort of newsreel behind-the-scenes footage of Animal Farm, and you see John with a mirror in front of himself doing a kind of gurning impression and then drawing it on the page. Do we know how much he actually drew for Animal Farm and for the films in general, and how much was he principally a director?
I really don't know too much about that. I should think that Viv and Jez would be better able to answer those questions, because I haven't done the research into it. At the time, I was, 5, 6 years old, and it was all happening around me. And for me now, it's history. It's very familiar history. I have great memories of being totally immersed in an animation household, but how much he was actually doing the animation, the design, I don't know. I think that Joy probably had a stronger hand in that, as well as definitely having a stronger hand in the scripting. But I could be corrected on that. I don't know what Jez and Viv think.
Jez and Viv, what do you think?
Well,
I guess, Vivien, maybe you could talk about the drawings for the book that they did, which they did sort of do collaboratively, didn't they?
They did. I mean, Dad always felt that other people were more talented than him, although he only ever told me that just after my mother had died, while we were waiting for the ambulance to take her body away. And he rushed, the first thing he did when she died was he rushed and got a copy of the illustrated version, the book of Animal Farm. And he went through it and he said, look, that's her drawing, that's my drawing. Look at her line. It's so much better than mine. And that's the first time I'd heard him really give her a big credit. A bit late, I thought. But they both drew, and he was a talented draftsman. But more, he was a techie guy. more he was a director and a producer, and he was always looking for talent, and he found it in other people, and he relied on my mother a lot. And once she'd gone, he really fell apart, because whatever their relationship was like, he really relied on her point of view and her opinion about things. So I think he was better than one might suppose, but at the same time, he was always cheating softly, as he said. I have always cheated softly, he told me. And I think he is a very complicated character that, although I've dug into it, I can't actually find anything very bad about him. And I think he was probably pretty talented.
I have to say that's quite a remarkable story, Vivien, about the ambulance and so on. Very, very sobering, and it does suggest someone who was quite cut up inside, really. That does suggest a kind of a vulnerability that perhaps wasn't immediately apparent behind the showman's exterior. Sorry, Jez, you were about to say something.
Just to say that, I mean, obviously there are these kind of very distinctive talents in animation, and they're not numerous, but you can find them. Sometimes it's a lot harder to find a really talented animation producer, somebody who can get money to make animation, somebody who can run a studio and can keep it in the kind of the difficult environments of British animation. And what is very clear is that what John was, you know, pivotal and fundamental in was kind of professionalizing the industry of British animation in terms of sort of setting up, helping set up a kind of an organization of British animators to bring them together in the late 1950s, setting up and kind of heralding an animation festival that was held at the BFI in 1957 as a kind of a one-off event that brought in kind of feature films as well as commercial and other stuff. So it's just kind of a showcase to the industry. And that's what he went on to do through Asset Fair and also Ikagrada in terms of the graphic design, and actually being able to do this and find this work and make it and keeping a company going. We could definitely do with some more talents like that. I mean, we have great animators, but we could definitely do with some more people who can find money to help them make films.
I think a very interesting dynamic is starting to emerge here. Very interesting, kind of looking quite below the surface. I would like to just stop and look at some of the questions that have been coming in. Yes, well, first of all, if viewers would like to write in questions, we'll have a sort of a Q&A at the end. Yes, we've got a comment from Jeremy Antrich. Great film, thank you. In my childhood, many decades ago, I knew a man named Henry Elwes, I think German, but living in Brazil. He had something to do with animated propaganda films in the 1940s. Has anyone heard of him? I think that's perhaps... oh well, Jez,
I've already actually sent him a message in chat that actually Henry Elwes was the guy who produced Music Man, so the first film that British animated film. So Henry Elwes, and he was the name that I was trying to remember when we had the setup in Monday. That basically, I think it's on the back of another letter that basically there's John sort of and vouching for him because he was German. He was struggling to find work in the Second World War, and vouching him, saying, "Can we take him on? He has experience as a cameraman." And then he made a few public information films on his own right, including a really interesting film. Using puppets. He kind of sort of worked on these kind of sort of puppet animation films in the immediate post-war period. So I'm interested to hear more about him. So we've actually already exchanged emails whilst you've been waffling on.
Give it a miss, yeah. Carla says, I'd like to come to this at the end, or a little bit later on, Carla. She writes, it would be interesting to hear more about the Hungarian traditions of animation that John brought to his work. I'd like to come to that a little bit later, if you don't mind, Carla. And Colin John Ford says, it was suggested in later years that Animal Farm was funded by the CIA. Do Vivien and Paul accept that? What can they do to tell us about that? Incidentally, I was assistant studio manager at Halas Batchelor in the late 1950s. So Colin John Ford, do you want to answer that, Vivien?
Yes, well, it came out kind of in dribs and drabs that it was indeed part funded by the CIA, because de Rochemont was working for the government and had been in the Navy making films for the Navy and the government. He started a docudrama under Hoover. He got the FBI to reenact whole scenes and shoot them for newsreels. And so they were part of it all. In fact, there is a very interesting thing that one of the animators recently had saved a whole load of artwork from a skip in the 70s when things were moving, and they've just been sold in Christie's for a fabulous sum. Pity I didn't sell them, hey, didn't just donate them to the nation. And they've been bought by something called the Spy Museum. And so they are, everybody knows now that this was partly funded by the CIA, but in the early days, before they got up to terrible things, and so it was part of the Cold War push to promote American art, and they also sponsored people like Jackson Pollock. So, you know, my parents were out there with other sponsored people, but they didn't actually know it for sure until much later.
I think it's unfair to criticise. It has been levelled at them a number of times, but I think it's unfair given that they were unaware of it at the time. Joanna, I'd like to return to you. You mentioned about, well, we've been discussing Joy's role in a deeply patriarchal industry, and you mentioned the 1980s when there was a big push for new voices within animation. Now, I saw Sarah Ann Kennedy's documentary, British Animation Women Breaking the Mold, I think it's called, and I think you're one of the interviewees in that film, and it suggests that actually the animation industry even now is still not representative, that the number of male directors of animation far exceeds the number of women directors of animation. Are we living in a more enlightened age, or are we actually in a way returning to the climate that Joy herself had to navigate?
Well, I think just over the last few months, with the Black Lives Matter campaign, and it's just teaching people about mindfulness, really, and about what do you call it? Basically, you know, people employ people who look like them, you know, and there are a lot of men in charge, and I think there has to be there are a lot of men who work in animation, and a lot of men who run film festivals, and a lot of men who run studios. And for instance, recently, because there seemed to be an awful lot of men who were being invited onto juries, you know, in animation festivals, and you think, hang on a minute, where are all the women, you know? And it's because, and I know why it is, it's because people know people, and they're all friends, you know, and they may be very nice men and, you know, lovely, but they're still men and probably white. So people have to make a real effort to think outside of the box and to start really looking for other people who aren't like themselves. And I think it was in the last Ottawa Film Festival, they were talking about this because there were more women than men on the jury. And so they decided that, and it was great and it worked, and they decided to write a list of all of the women directors that they can think of and give it to all the festival directors who might not know all of these women, so that they can say, here is a wonderful list of women that you can invite onto your festivals, you know, to be on your juries, because it does make a difference if it's an all-male jury, and it really does make a difference. And I was really shocked when I saw the list. It went on and on and on. And of course, then it went online and people were adding to this list. And it was hundreds of these women that you were looking through going, of course, oh yes, and there's her, you know, like, and there's no excuse whatsoever for festivals to have all male juries, selection committees, or speakers at events, and it happened. You know, it happened to Annecy. I thought when I looked at all of the speakers, they were all, not all of them, but majority were men, and your heart just sinks a little bit because you think, oh, I just want to see some new faces, new blood, new stories. So, but I think things are afoot. I think people are starting to poke fingers and say, hang on a minute, that's, you know, and to remind people that you can't just carry on like this. There has to be change.
I think Jez may be able to inform me, but I saw a list of important female film directors of the 20th century, and I'm happy to say that Joy was on the list, quite high up. Can you remind me what the list was, Jez? Are you familiar with it? I can't remember where I saw it, but I was delighted that Joy was recognised, although belatedly.
We live in a world of listicles online, so who knows where that could be from. There's the whole thing's out there. I guess it's also worth pointing out that you think of two big animation enterprises in the UK at the moment of Lupus, headed by Ruth and Camilla, and Locksmith, starting up with Judy and Sarah. They're actually some of these two big companies heralded by women, and so that's a progressive step to some extent.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I've led us a bit of a long way from John and his Hungarian origin here. Now, Vivien, you told me a story that the other day about Joy's own Hungarian identity. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, when they came back from Budapest, just before the war, and they started working for J. Walter Thompson, and with the outbreak of war, that was kind of seconded into being the MOI. And in order to work and make films for the MOI, the Ministry of Information, they needed my father, so not to be sent off to the Isle of Man, was it? The Isle of Man, the Isle of Wight? Yeah.
Isle of Man.
I made that mistake the other day, but yes.
Well, I get confused. And so in order to save him, they got married. So Mum thought that by marrying him, he would become a British citizen. But oh no, she's a woman. He's a man. So what happens? She became Hungarian. Oops. So instead of, he was saved because the government gave him special dispensation because they needed him for the films. But what happened was, for the duration of the war, and in fact up until about 1951, she was not British anymore. And that came as a terrible shock. And also it meant that they were under curfew and had to work at home and not in the studio in the evenings.
It's remarkable that she, in a way, then became, by extension, dependent upon him, rather than he marrying her and becoming a British citizen that way. She had to become Hungarian. It does suggest, yes, very much one is dependent upon the other, which is quite sobering. Now, I'd just like to look at some of the questions. Fran Lloyd says, I'd like to ask about the interconnections between the animation studios in the early 1940s, because so many people seem to move across them. Vera, Peter Sachs, Alma Sachs, Francois Chagrin, etc. So I think that's a question for you, Jez. The interconnections between the animation studios in the 1940s.
But without going into too much detail, I mean, Vera, who is a real star of Richard's documentary, Vera is a legend. I asked her about, in terms of moving from Halas Batchelor to Larkins, and she did feel it was a more open atmosphere for her creatively. So one of the reasons that she left to go to Larkins, because it gave her the opportunities to make things in a different way. It seemed to be a more interesting artistic enterprise for her, and she wasn't the only one who kind of moved there. So you have Wally Crook, who was a sort of pivotal figure in. She was the key animator. It's a confusing name. Her name was Rosalie, but she's known as Wally. She was the key animator at Halas Batchelor in the 1940s, and her leaving Halas Batchelor is a little bit obscure in that she's there in 1951, and she seems to go out when all the men come in to animate on Animal Farm, which is interesting itself and probably a different story. But she also went to Larkins, but was lesser known there because she worked in a different unit. You have Beryl Stevens, who also started. She initially worked at Gallant British Animation. She felt that was a studio that was actually almost misogynist in terms of its approach towards women, and the women, there was no male animators. This was an enterprise that J. Arthur Rank set up in the post-war period to take on Disney at his own game, and he trained up animators for about 3 years. David Hand came over from America, and no men were in the animation, no women were in the animation room. There just wasn't any, and they were all in the ink and paint department in a building that was known as the Hungary. So Beryl got out of there quick sharp, and she went to Halas Batchelor, one of the few female animators to actually work on Animal Farm. She only remembered a couple of them. And then she also went to Larkins. And this interconnectedness seems to be sort of with different studios opening and closing. So all the men who benefited from this animation training at Gallant British Animation, it was kind of, they had 3 years in this Disney school almost in the UK. When that went bankrupt, they were there to be lapped up by other studios. And so of the 5 named animators in Animal Farm, 4 of them went through that Gallant British Animation scheme. And they went on to have the key animator jobs for up into the 1980s and 90s, this kind of unprecedented schooling that they had. So there definitely does seem to be a network of animators moving around them, even out to the extent of Alison Dyer based out in Stroud. There seems to, you have Wally Crook working out there, you have Spud Houston working out there, and then coming back into London. So the kind of the freelance community that I guess we're familiar with was today, it was kind of partly, it was kind of hiring people who and there was a smaller body of talent, and the work came in bulges, and so people went from studio to studio. So that's a vague way of answering the question, but it's a hotbed of as is today. I think.
But I think it would be fair to say that in one way or another, the history of Halas Batchelor is the history of British animation, in that so many people passed through in different waves and in different sort of historical stages of the studio. Is that fair, do you think?
Definitely, from Bob Foldes to Bob Bogglefree into Peter Foldes, all the way through to Roger Mainwood, being a sort of pivotal figure coming up and making from like Autobahn with John in 1979, and going on and then directing Ethel and Ernest later, and becoming sort of key, working on Snowman and everything else. And at that point, I'm making the documentary in terms of the Animal Farm being a pinch point in the history. Then it was. There was so many people went through their doorsteps, and whether it's going off to Canada or wherever and making their careers, America, all kinds of places. It was a Jeff Dunbar coming through, all these kind of leading animators, Oscar Grillo, they all basically went through Halas Batchelor.
Which I think is a testament to the, I suppose, the core values of the studio and its success as an enterprise. I just want to have another look at the questions here. Well, this is a comment. As a resident of Stroud, I'm especially interested in the connection with Stroud that was mentioned in the film. Whereabouts is the studio situated? How long did they use it for? What was done there? As I believe they also were working in London at the same time. We might be able to deal with that very, very quickly, but there's a key question here which will bring us back to the main theme of the evening, which I, of course, now can't find. Ah, yes, it would be from Carla. It would be interesting to hear more about the Hungarian traditions of animation that John brought to his work. How much of John's identity, his outlook, his vision was dependent on a product on his Hungarian origins, on his Hungarian identity? Vivien, I think we start with you on this.
Well, if you think that his formative years, he went to the studio of Bortnik Sandor, and it was there that he kind of sucked up this idea of the Bauhaus, which was very, very big in his mind. And so this tradition, this Bauhaus tradition, which seeps through all our lives, you know, if you go to IKEA and places like that, if we look at our shelving, it's all to do with a kind of Bauhaus tradition. And so I don't know if it's so much Hungarian, but that, would you call it Middle European feel of all the people that came and enriched this country, America, all those immigrants that came in, that brought with them their culture and made ours much richer.
I think that's an excellent point to finish on, but I would also like to ask about, John was passionate about bringing collaborators over from Hungary, and Peter Foldesh has already been mentioned. Would you like to say a little bit more like that? Because he seemed to be actively bringing and saving a number of people and building a kind of Hungarian artistic community, would it be fair to say?
Are you asking me?
I am, yes.
Oh, right. Well, I've got a little blank here. There is a wonderful Hungarian animator who I'm sure the people at the Cultural Centre will know, because he's been there. And he was the last of John's great protégés, who he brought over to work on something called Motu the Elephant. He had a young student come over with his girlfriend, and this guy is now sort of he's kind of the status quo and well-known animator in Hungary. And if I could only remember his name, we'd all be winning. I need a bit of help because I can't remember.
Jez, can you help us here with your encyclopedia?
Geza Todd?
Geza
Todd.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Geza came, and I tell you, they had a ball because Dad was very generous. They had the best wines, the best food, all brought up. Dad was quite elderly and forgetful and ill, and they all had a wonderful time in the studio in Hampstead.
Yes.
But he had this tradition of bringing people, young people, and nurturing them. And that's what he did, from Roger Mainwood to Geza and many others who he brought in.
Just to chip in one thing, if you are interested in Hungarian animation, then I've just, there's a 3-disc box set of Hungarian animation of the 60s, 70s and 80s that I've just reviewed something else, and there's some extraordinary work in there. I mean, the stuff coming out of the Pannonia studio was just incredible, and it's all very different, so it is very hard to sort of say the Hungarian style, but I was absolutely blown away. There was something on every disc that really just blew my socks off, particularly a film about scones, which if you ever see it will just it was great.
Well, perhaps you can post details on the Hungarian Cultural Centre on the Facebook page. That would be, because I want to see it now.
It's a Hungarian film archive compilation. You can probably find it on Amazon, but I
need a title, Jez. That's just not enough for me.
I'll go
now, sadly, we're going to have to wrap things up, but I would like to say, just to echo what Vivien said about enriching British animation and culture and having a series of protégés, I think, might be part of John's lasting legacy. And I think Joy's as a role model, although one who is only belatedly recognised. I think we are going to have to finish, unfortunately. I would like to thank Vivien, Jez, Paul and Joanna. I would also like to thank Sophia Neal, although I've pronounced her name probably completely incorrectly. And I'd like to, thank you everyone who took part this evening, and thank you to all the viewers too. And I'm sorry, perhaps Lorelei Prosser, I think if you look in Joy's book, you'll be able to find the address of the studio in Stroud. So I'd like to
Yes, Paul could just tell you.
Oh yes, sorry, Paul.
I live in Stroud, actually.
I didn't know this.
Yes, I'm just up the road from the old vicarage that was their studio during the 1950s, where a lot of Animal Farm was made. And I think that if Lorelei wants to know more, I think I know her mum and dad, so she should get in touch.
Excellent. I'd just like to read some final comments. Carla, to everyone, wonderful to hear that. Is there a BFI compilation? Well, there is it Blue Dolphin, Vivien?
Network distributing.
Network.
It's on our website where you can get all the things. And a lot of it, of course, is on the BFI player. Yes. Jez Stewart, I don't know who that is. Gems of Hungarian Animation, Volume 1 to 3. Carla, fascinating to discover more about this history. Many thanks. Zeno, Zeno's popped off. Thank you for the interesting information and story. Aaron Wood, thank you all. Brilliant evening. Marilyn Green, thanks. Very interesting and great documentary too. Abby, this is really interesting. Bella Honus Rowe, thank you for a great film and a fascinating Q&A. So great to celebrate British animation. So, and someone else, can we go to bed
there's another person called Jed Stewart. Can I go to bed now? Yes, all right. You've earned the right. Yes, you've earned the right. Well, thank you to you all. And I would now like to hand over to Monica Boneducken. Thank you for allowing me to take part. I've had an absolutely marvellous time.
I'll be very brief. The night is drawing on. I look a very funny colour. My apologies for that. But yes, I just want to extend a thanks, obviously, to the wonderful participants, but also to the Hungarian Cultural Centre for partnering Insiders Outsiders on what's been a really wonderful, fascinating, and thought-provoking evening with so much more that could be said, but it's good to end perhaps on that note. But I would also like to extend my very warm thanks to somebody without whom the film wouldn't, of course, exist, and that's Richard Shaw, the director, who can't be with us tonight. I also just wanted, if I may, to remind those of you, or to tell those of you who may not be aware of the fact, that this event tonight is part of a 2-week series of events on themes related to the Insiders Outsiders Festival that took place from March 2019 to March 2020, which is now has an afterlife in virtual form, a blessing in disguise, as they say. It straddles, I mean, it's essentially all about the contribution of the refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to British culture in all its aspects. And what you've said, of course, absolutely dovetails with that general tribute, that feeling of indebtedness. It seemed to me that actually Halas and Batchelor in particular, husband and wife that they were, for all the problematic nature of their professional and personal relationship, are a wonderful example, both of, well, I mean, you've got John coming with his committed internationalism, and I think that's something that was a feature of nearly everybody who did come to these shores. But it's also a symbiosis, isn't it, of the temperamental European and the calmer native-born British woman, and I leave aside gender politics for the moment, that's been talked about quite a lot, but I think that idea of symbiosis, of a kind of give and take, is actually really crucial as well. And just going back to the wider programme, the Internment episode has been mentioned more than once. It was the Isle of Man, not the Isle of Wight. If you're interested in pursuing that further, and it's a very morally murky and still to be excavated subject, there are a number of talks about internment that took place during Refugee Week, which are actually available as recordings on the Insiders Outsiders Festival website. And also coming up on the 28th, next Tuesday, Alan Powers, you mentioned Vivien, the Bauhaus, he's going to be talking about an unfamiliar aspect of Bauhaus activity, and that is the wartime activity of those Bauhaus personnel, as you put it, who came to this country and actually contributed to the British war effort, just as indeed your own father did. So I would very much urge you to check that out and attend if you can. So I think enough for one evening. Thank you very much, everyone, and all the best, and thanks for being with us. Goodbye. Bye.
Right, bye. Many thanks.
All right.